Bring this a little closer.
So we're live on YouTube. Just give me 1 second on the LinkedIn side.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose you better move around so that we're not frozen.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, we are live. I just want to check the LinkedIn quickly, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, it's live on LinkedIn. You can start. When you're ready, Greg.
Yes, Connor.
It's a go, Greg.
Are we good to go?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Very good. Greetings, all. Welcome to our discussion today, titled Uncharted Waters, Navigating Supply Chains in a Post-USAID World. I'm Greg Schlegel, your facilitator for today's fireside chat. Our distinguished panelists bring very extensive personal experience in healthcare and the NGO arena. Through questions of discovery and panelists' reactions to those questions, we are hoping to provide you with personal and professional insights around the immediate impacts of coping with and potential paths forward regarding the withdrawal of USAID funding. I'm the founder of the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. We are 33 companies, 1,700 supply chain risk professionals operating in 23 countries at the moment. We educate, consult, and implement software that identifies, assesses, mitigates, and manages supply chain risk. We've worked with over 20 healthcare NGOs over the last 8 years to improve their supply chain performance, mitigate risk, and save lives. I'll start the discussion with the introduction of our August panel with Ahmad Habash, next Andrew Brown, and finally Craig Uswell. So with that, I will turn it over to Ahmad to introduce himself. Ahmad.
Thanks, Greg. Good evening, everyone. Please allow me to introduce myself here. My name is Ahmad Al-Habash, and I am the supply chain professional joining from Help Logistics. I come with more than 12 years of technical experience in logistics and supply chain, both in the private as well as the humanitarian sector, with overall 9 years within the humanitarian sector itself. I have completed my BA in logistics science, as well as my MA in public management and good governance. Currently, I work as a supply chain consultant, with Help Logistics through our Middle East regional office, currently based in Amman, Jordan, hence the good evening side, specializing in partnership management. Through our work in the region, focusing on raising humanitarian supply chain efficiency and effectiveness, My hope is that I will be able to shed some light today on tangible effects that the USAID funding withdrawal has had specifically on our region, as well as the repercussions that it had on local supply chains and by extension on people's lives. Over.
Thank you, Ahmad. We'll move over to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Greg. And it's exciting to be here, everyone. Greetings from Australia. I'm Andrew Brown, a pharmacist with a supply chain speciality. I've been involved in supply chain in different aspects for some 30 years, whether it's from a clinical perspective, or whether it's from a private sector perspective, academia, and the last 12 years or so in international development in the health sector, working either in government or within the NGOs. I've had the privilege of being to many countries of the world to work alongside many colleagues to help strengthen health supply chains. Really excited to be here. And I'm hoping that by the time you leave here, you'll be really renewed in your vigor to do what we can to make medicines available for the most needy in our world. It's exciting to be here. Thank you so much, Greg.
You bet. Thank you, Andrew. And Craig?
Thanks, Greg. Good morning, all. I've seen a lot of the names that have signed up for this event today and really look forward to some dialogue between us through the questions that you ask and the answers we can try and offer. I've been in this space for more than 20 years in supply chain. Most of you that are on the call will know me from the SCMS program where I worked from 2007 to 2012. I retired from Deloitte in June 2024. So this is month 9 of my retirement, but have been watching with interest the dilemma that is unfolding and very keen to have some conversation and some discussion around how we can get you guys back on your feet and how we can mitigate the risk that you're facing from the most recent events. Thank you very much, Andrew. Greg.
No problem. Thank you, gentlemen. A couple of quick admin announcements for the audience. Regarding the fireside chat format today, I'm going to pose a few questions to the panelists. We'll do our best to entertain follow-up questions from you, the audience, after the panelists provide their insights on each question. We got 3 basic major questions that we're going to pose to the panelists. All right. Please pose your questions in the chat, if you will, and I'll do my best to voice them to the panelists associated with each major question. Time permitting, we'll address any outstanding questions you might have at the end of the session. This session will be recorded. It'll be placed on the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium website, and all questions will be answered by the panelists in this session verbally and or written on the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium website by close of business March 24 of this year. All right. So with that, we would like to begin. Let's begin with the first question to the panelists, and that is to Ahmad. And the question is, how do you view the effects of the sudden withdrawal of USAID funding on global supply chains, particularly in regions that relied heavily on its aid? Ahmad.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you for leading with this question that I feel is an important one to break the ice into this dilemma that we're facing now. Well, the effects of the USAID withdrawal have been devastating, to put it mildly. And this is based on the incremental evidence that have been put out there. Let me walk you through it. Globally, according to the ICVA, which is a global network of 170 non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that is based in Switzerland, a global survey of theirs among NGOs and the NGO networks last month found out that 68% of the respondents rely on USAID funding, with almost all of them, 67%, receiving a stop work order, an SWO. Furthermore, 78% of the respondents had SWOs that impacted contracts worth more than 100K USD, whereas 39% reported an even higher value of impact at $1 million and above. This high impact, high value effect on humanitarian organizations means that the downstream effects of this funding withdrawal have been just as devastating, with 80% of respondents reporting partnership impacts. And from a supply chain perspective, the private sector has, in many cases, been just as affected financially as many of the humanitarian organizations in the sector. As organizations rush to cancel their procurement, the construction, the consultancy, employment contracts that they had with the different providers. And this is an important aspect to highlight, to understand that this is not only a humanitarian organization issue, it's a local economy issue as well. Not to say that it's also confined to one region, but it's also a globally, understandably, everyone is affected to a certain extent. Now, within our region itself, and I'm only taking Jordan, the country that I'm based in and from, as an example, the latest estimate puts the number of people that have been directly furloughed. And for that aspect, this is, again, emphasis on directly being let go of. As a result of the funding withdrawal, the number is at 35K, so 35,000 people, which represents more than 1.1% of the country's total labor force, the active labor force within the country, which is beyond significant for, especially given the fact that the economic footprint of the withdrawal itself on the small size Jordanian economy relevant to the GDP is also quite significant. As last year, USAID's funding alone to Jordan for last year was a total of $1.7 billion, which represents around 3.5% of the country's GDP. And again, this is only for Jordan as an example. So when you take into account that in 2023 alone, the US funding has, generally speaking, supported programs and activities in over 177 individual countries and 29 different regions across the world, with the majority of that funding being allocated to highly vulnerable regions, such as within the Middle East and in Africa, then the global consequences of the funding withdrawal become even clearer. And to that extent, supply chains, as we normally put it out there, it is a chain for a reason, and your supply chain is only as good as your weakest link. And if that weakest link revolves around the absence of the financial resources where you would be able to keep up the economy in certain regions, then the effects become even more devastating for the entire community across the world. Over.
Thank you very much. Very sobering and impactful statistics from your perspective as well. Thanks. Andrew, your thoughts on the question?
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Ahmad, for that introduction. I'd like to take a slightly different approach in answering this question, because I think it's really important to acknowledge the extremely large amount of investment that the US government has made in health systems and health supply chain specifically. I've heard figures of 38 to 40% of global development funding has been through a US government entity and so on. That's over a long time. Now, this is support for both the health products and the strengthening of the systems needed to ensure availability and use of quality products for the most needy in our world. So they've been pulling above their weight. And now that that's been withdrawn, it means that we're feeling a great shock. But why did they invest so much previously? It was for the benefit of a safer world and stronger economies. And so I think the absence of that funding is going to cause some critical issues. And here are a couple. I was reading some material from the immediate past assistant administrator of USAID, and he was noting that more than 80% of the contracts have been terminated, representing the work that's done by USAID, the for-profit and not-for-profit organization. So that's a lot of funding. But what does this mean in terms of health? A couple of figures he quoted, he was estimating that their internal modeling, more than 160,000 people could die from malaria this next year if those funded programs are not renewed in some way. There are 20 million people that are dependent on HIV medicine that has been generously funded historically by the US government. The question is, how many of those can be maintained on treatment in the absence of USAID funding? And there's an expectation that there will be hundreds of thousands that could die in year one, unless that gap is fixed. What's also interesting is that from the immunization side, that there is estimated that more than 1 million estimated deaths will occur because of the disruption in immunization. So I think it's significant, catastrophic in many environments. And I think that there has also been a discourse to say that the modalities of how international aid has been delivered has come under some criticism. There's some suggestions that a traditional aid approach has led to a level of dependence, that others have perhaps not been pulling their weight, and that needs more to be done with local organizations and actors. And in fact, in the last few years, as many on this webinar will know, that there's been this increasing focus on strengthening local systems and getting more funding and more work through local organizations. But this hiatus, having occurred so quickly, has meant that people have not had a chance to adjust. So I think we've got significant health issues coming our way, and it's going to be the supply chain professionals in country that are going to now be really looking for these opportunities and looking forward to helping unpack a bit later. So thanks so much, Greg. Back to you.
You bet. Andrew, thanks a lot. Thanks for an additional scope and scale, especially geared around the healthcare impact of the withdrawal. So with that, we'll move into Craig. What are your thoughts on our first question?
Thanks, Greg, and also thanks, Ahmed, for crystallizing the impact on Jordan. And I'm sure all the viewers have done the same kind of exercise for their respective countries. Andrew, also great that you raised some of the issues that we've all been reading about. And my focus is more around what do we need to do on a country by country basis to recover from this. But here are some thoughts that I've had on this particular question. USAID was bigger than all the other donors combined in the supply chain arena. And that just has been always. So to Andrew's point, the sudden exit of this funding is a really shocking event, because overnight, what was well organized and a very well orchestrated and seasoned campaign to solve issues has just stopped in its tracks. Even the Global Fund received a large portion of their funding from USAID, so it's still to be understood what that'll do to impact the Global Fund's efforts. First of all, we have to assume that USAID funding is not coming back. So planning for the future as if there's no more funding is an important mindset to achieve. Not a forever hoping that something will change. Let's assume it won't change. And if we behave that way and it does change for some reason, or some of it comes back, that's an unexpected win. Regions and individual countries will need to organize themselves and ideally collaborate to solve the problems and the requirements that they have. Engage with remaining donors to see where you can get urgent help. It would seem logical that interrupted drug supplies and distribution must probably be the most important problem to tackle. And then one final thought is that other donors have often designed their efforts around the foundation occupied by USAID. Without this foundation, their priorities and programs may need to change too. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation, look forward to the questions. And again, Ahmed and Andrew, thanks for framing it in the way you did. Over to you, Greg.
You bet. Thanks, Craig. And again, thanks for giving the audience a bit of a scope and scale on cause and effect of the withdrawal. So before we ask any questions of the audience, do the panelists have any type of follow-up? Do you all have any type of follow-up on the threads that we just talked about? I'll ask that first. Okay, good. I'm looking at the audience profile. I don't see any overt questions at the moment, folks. All right, I don't. And if we do get one, remember, I'll try to voice it out and to the panelists. But at the moment, we don't have any questions associated with our first thread. So with that, we'll move into our next question to the panelists, and that is, with USAID's funding absent, what alternative mechanisms or organizations can fill the void to ensure the stability of supply chains in those vulnerable regions? And at this time, we'll start with Craig. So if you'd like to give the audience your perspective on that question, sir.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for also phrasing, give the audience your perspective. I'm sure I speak for Andrew and Ahmed as well, but these are our opinions based on our experience. They're just starting points for this entire journey, which is going to be painful and hopefully liberating and rewarding at the same time. So there are unfortunately no other historical countries or organizations that can offer the same scale and scope of USAID funding. It just is a fact, and nothing one can do or wish will ever change that. Self-sufficiency is simply the only way forward. This can start by identifying leaders in each supply chain area in your country or region and organizing around that leadership team. Those teams then identify the priorities for the country and set an action plan to solve the priorities facing them. A suggestion would be to use the supply chain operations reference or score model approach. Identify in your country planners, procurement experts, warehouse and distribution experts, and start adopting what USAID teams of consultants have shared as recommendations over the previous decades. For many, many years, there's been what they've called technical assistance, where experts come in, assess the situation in your country, and offer recommendations on how to improve or sustain it in a more successful manner. There's reports from these technical assistance engagements that have these recommendations and identified issues to solve. Review them and get some of those objectives underway. Finally, collaborate regionally and on the continent with nearby countries or those that have expertise that you need. For example, Botswana has been buying their own drugs for years, and they can help you navigate procurement. Mozambique has a strategy to outsource distribution to the private sector. Asking them to share their lessons learned would be a good plan. Zambia, Rwanda, Nigeria, and Kenya have also had good success in certain areas. There's many other examples that will be evident as you start to collaborate. Suffice to say that everyone can offer something to assist your country. Thanks, Greg.
You bet. Thanks, Greg. And we'll move over to Andrew. Your thoughts on question number 2.
Thanks. I'd like to just build off what Craig has said, and again, just to emphasize the thoughts I'm sharing are from the experience over time and just a starting point for discussion. Really like to encourage people to put some items in the chat as well. Just moving on with what Craig has said, I agree. I think it's very unlikely that any one donor or combination of donors can provide the same level of funding. And so if we try and flip this and think about what the opportunity is, countries have been doing more to lead the health supply chains in their countries over time, and organizations that I've been involved with historically, like MSH, IntraHealth, Comonix, and others, with various programs traditionally supported by USAID, have been looking to support countries as they lead. And I think this is an underlying principle for sustainable success moving forward. I think at this country level, there's going to be increased pressure to increase domestic financing. A lot of people are talking about that. But in countries with high levels of need for financial assistance in the health sector, this is going to be difficult. Health supply chains is often at the bottom of the in tray for the Minister of Health. I think there's an opportunity here, though, for governments to lead the bringing together of local actors and take on an ecosystem approach that looks at improved efficiencies, improved use of technology, and greater involvement of the private sector in ways that make sense for the country context. It's the professionals and organizations in countries that understand best. And I think this act of bringing people together and exploring more the ecosystem and how the pieces may become more efficient is a way to move forward. Just building on what Craig said, there are pockets of excellence in a number of countries on the African continent, on the Asian continent, continent, and many places globally. And I think exploring opportunities for country-country exchange and for peer-to-peer support. Some of these opportunities already exist. So, for example, the International Association of Public Health Logisticians have and its country chapters are ways of connecting across ecosystems in countries to share knowledge. Finance is needed for sure, but expertise and information exchange is also needed. And in addition to IPHL, regional initiatives, for example, Pharma Connect, which is a regional pharmaceutical systems initiative trying to get a range of people together to discuss issues to do with pharmacy systems and supply chain, are going to be looking at networking events. Just two examples of what that might look like. So I think, where are we in a local context? What are the strengths? What have we got? Where are the people? And how can those local contexts be brought together and led in such a way that can bring solutions locally, and looking for those technical resources that are available to share and to move forward. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for giving us a few insights on alternative mechanisms. We're going to talk about that throughout the discussion. We'll finish up this second thread of questions and answers with Ahmad. Go ahead there, sir.
Thanks, Greg. And well, allow me to be a bit more bleak than my compatriots on this aspect. From my personal view and based on my experience, both regionally and globally, I think that due to the scale of USAID's funding portfolio and its unique funding mechanisms, most governments and aid organizations, realistically, within the Middle East specifically, would find it very difficult to allocate an alternative funding mechanism or an alternative working mechanism that would even maintain existing programs, let alone, kickstart new ones with, taking into account the ever-evolving needs. Now, with US funding accounting for 43% out of the total public humanitarian funding in 2023 alone, as well as other governments and donors shedding and slashing aid contributions beforehand, taking the UK as an example, Sweden and Norway too, it has become almost impossible, from what I've seen, for most, if not all, organizations to mitigate the financial effects and the fallout that the withdrawal has had incurred on them. This is coupled with the fact that the funding withdrawal was not communicated in advance to those most affected and to the organizations that have been struck first, with the exception of the stop work orders, which were sudden and swift. And as such, most organizations had little time to adjust, let alone to mitigate and work on strategies, which would have allowed the organizations a better manner of how to handle this, as well as lower a lot of the litigation costs that will be incurred as a result of the furloughs, as well as the contracts that have been canceled and put on hold, etc. So that's another aspect that my hope is that we can look at later down the line. This also meant that looking for alternatives, which requires quite some hefty amount of time, drafting proposals, setting up new budgets, and communicating those to other potential organizational donors, institutional donors, private parties, etc., was not put in place by some of those project teams that have already been put on hold. So that's also an aspect that, in my opinion, had a drastic effect on what alternative mechanisms these organizations can possibly tap into. Another aspect, and this is within the Middle East, and due to the fragility of many of the contexts that rely on USAID funding here, as well as many recent humanitarian crises within the region, as you're well aware, the severity of the needs is further impacted by the fact that there are no alternative mechanisms of delivering aid into certain areas due to the political nature of those crises to begin with. And as such, that aid inflow and that level of support was coupled with the fact that it came with a political arm that represents the United States of America. And as such, having the political arm that goes within the humanitarian aid aspect is an important aspect that I don't think any other donor has the same weight or the same will to take on going forward. which also limits a lot of the responses that are currently evolving all around the Middle East, whether in Palestine, in Yemen, in Syria, Iraq, and others, and potentially would lower the ability in case these political crises evolve into something more, as we have seen previously in Syria, for example, when a natural disaster was hitting regions that were already in a fragile setting as a result of a political crisis. This was amplified even further, and this could have drastic impacts on the populations as a whole. When you have no alternative mechanism realistically that is able to respond to most of those needs in the same manner, or in a manner that befits those needs. Over.
Ahmad, thank you very much. Thanks for the thread associated with the political aspects of the public health care as well. That concludes our second set of questions. We actually have some questions from the audience, which I'd like to take a pause. And yes, Craig, did you want to make a follow-up?
Yes, thanks, Greg. Something that resonated with me, which Ahmed had just mentioned, and a couple of Andrew's points as well. The sobering fact is that everyone on this call has been directly, personally, and also adjacently impacted by this event. And that's just a sobering fact. So the other thing to remind people of is that there's tens of thousands of highly competent professionals available for mindful funders to harness and deploy. Now, if an agency that has got in their mind to try and plug this hole, and they have a country that is dear to their hearts, there's no shortage of experts out in the wings who are probably going to be very happy to work for anything to try and redeploy their knowledge and their assistance, and arguably feed their families as well. So I think we need to find some mechanism to catalyze a forum where these available practitioners can be made available, vis-a-vis their names, and some sort of facilitation effort to let a single repository of who's available and who's willing, for any donors that might look at the situation and say, hey, we could use some help. There's certainly no shortage of expertise out there. Thanks.
You bet. You bet. Yeah, we have a couple of questions that I believe emanate from our first two threads. So I will read the question, and then the panel, you guys can answer at will. First question. What are 3 things other donors should do to respond in the short term and the medium term? Who wants to start? Go ahead, Ahmed.
That's a very good question. In my opinion, one way we can extend the leverage of the current crisis to the donor side is by simply asking the donors to lower a bit some of their expectations on how some of these organizations can possibly mitigate the fallout of the USAID funding withdrawal. As I said, the request for written proposals, budgets that are finalized might not be a realistic ask out of these organizations, given the scale and the severity of the impact that it had on the structures that are already placed in many organizations, as well as the fact that many of those needs assessments are obsolete by nature, because the fallout has had some tangible effects on many organizations pulling out of the market, if you will, and of the ability to sustain some of those needs within fragile settings specifically. And as such, this needs to be highlighted when considering chipping in and helping out those organizations tackle those needs. So the needs are on one side, they're being amplified. On the other hand, organizations are getting less funding support, and they have less personnel and resources, both human and financial, to take those on. So it's good to have donor flexibility in that sense. and it would come in real handy, I know for a fact, for many organizations. Another aspect, of course, would go around local governments. My colleagues mentioned examples within the African continent, for example, from Botswana to Rwanda, etc., where a localized approach through this public-private partnership mechanisms, different ones in different sectors, also paid fruit in terms of mitigating the fallout that such crises would have. So that's another approach, but also that needs a bit of, let's say, a crowd support, if that is applicable. If not, then donors also need to step in and have that flexibility, room of working with small-scale actors, community-based organizations, rather than the level of INGOs and the level of institutional organizations, UN, etc., that would have been able to take advantage of their funding otherwise. Over.
Great, thank you. Any other panelists, gentlemen? Anyone want to follow up on that, on our first question from the audience?
Just a quick addition, if I may.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I think one of the critical things is how to support country leadership to get a handle on what's going on and where to invest. So really, we all know the best type of aid is really to make sure we're engaging with local governments and understand their priorities and work together. And how can we do that more effectively? So I think we've spoken a lot about enabling organizations in different country contexts and how we support those. And I think that's important and often necessary because country governments have stronger and weaker aspects of technical excellence. And I think that one of the elements here is that this is a crisis. And coming back to what Ahmad said before, I'm an optimist, but also with a touch of pragmatism. And there is disaster and greater disasters coming. And I think being able to look at that, being able to stratify where the issues are and look at those priorities with the government's assistance would be a way to ensure that money is well spent. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Good. All right. Any other comments? Craig, did you want to follow up on that first question from the audience? Fire away.
Yeah, just another angle, or maybe different words to say the same thing that Ahmed said, is that existing donors could well be able to pivot in the direction of some of the gaps that they're facing, such as interruption of medicine supply. I'm sure they could pivot from some of the existing obligations and requirements, which are maybe not that urgent, to go in that direction. And then over the years, there's been a vast effort to try and get expats that are living overseas to donate to the countries and to try and help stimulate the country's prosperity. Oftentimes they've got families which they regularly send money to in their home countries. And these individuals could literally mobilize, to coin Ahmed's phrase, crowdsource funding amongst their own present ecosystem in the country in which they now reside. So there's many, many ways. These are none of them are any more than a short-term injection to stave off the challenge, but every bit helps. Thanks.
You bet. All right. We have more questions, gents, which I think is the right time to pose these. Here's a specific question from the audience. Beyond the USAID withdrawal, what sort of programs can continue, like health systems strengthening, PSS? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. I can jump in. So PSS stands for Pharmaceutical System Strengthening, for those on the call who are not familiar with that abbreviation. Basically, USAID has historically been the largest donor in the area of health system strengthening and pharmaceutical system strengthening, but not the only one. And there are a number of donors working in this space, whether it's Gavi, Global Fund, Gates, and others. They have their different programs. But more and more professional associations are getting involved, whether it's ASCM, whether it's Commonwealth Pharmacists Association, whether it's IFPW, whether it's a range of other professional entities. So there are people working in this space, both donors and professional associations. And I think the way forward is, in a country context, is to see what entities are present and who has interest, and to be able to see their priorities and how you might build on them with your priorities. Thanks, Greg.
Any other panelists have any insight on PSS to answer the question? Go ahead,
Greg,
Ahmed.
I'll just add one point, and it's not a technical one on PSS per se. I think that there's an opportunity that comes with every challenge, and in this case, despite the severity of this current funding withdrawal, I see there's an opportunity in there somewhere, and that opportunity relies on building systems that are more resilient, systems that are more local, systems, and in this case, I'm talking about health systems specifically, systems that are, based on the needs rather than on priorities that, maybe befit a regional aspect or a globalized approach. And to that end, supply chains, specifically local supply chains and local actors, might eventually benefit from this, although at the moment there's a lot of suffering. At the moment, there's a lot of needs not being met. But this could be an opportunity to start building, rather than from top to bottom, that bottom layer could start being empowered enough going further for us to have a system that is more befitting of the needs there. But it will take some time. It will take a lot of external support as well through the alternative mechanisms that we discussed. Sorry. But it also needs to be put out there that, for me, that is the only viable solution out of this that is, high in longevity as well.
Good. All right. Any other comments? Go ahead, Craig. Fire away.
Thanks, Greg. I think obviously PSS is one of the puzzle pieces. And in this space, we know the complexity, we know the dependencies. Every puzzle piece is important for the people that are managing that piece. But every puzzle piece also requires the other puzzle pieces to be lined up, don't they? And I think ultimately, as one assesses the country's dilemma from this funding gap, try and understand where lives can be saved. And maybe it's as simple as delivering some meds on time versus the system strengthening requirement that is the more of a long-term effort to sustain yourself. So you might find shifting your risk profile for this challenge you're facing right now might have different elements that come to the fore, because never before have we been facing something like this. So I think shifting that lens is an important thing to consider. If it doesn't immediately save a life, is it as important as something that does immediately save a life, in other words? Thanks.
Yep, you bet. No, the sense of urgency. Agree with that. All right, we have one more question for the panel, and then we can open it up again to specific questions. Appreciate the audience participation. Thank you very much. We have one more major thread that we'd like to pose to the panelists before we get into maybe another Q&A for a good long time. And that question is this: what are the potential long-term economic impacts on global supply chains due to the USAID's funding withdrawal, and how can organizations adapt to this change? We'll start off with Andrew on this thread.
Thanks, Greg. I've taken a different angle on this question just to hopefully promote some discussion. I think it's clear that great disruptions to supply chains and the fragility of those, I'm just noting Barry's questions and points in the chat, which we'll come back to. But I think from a health perspective, any reduction in health commodities in low middle income countries will equate to increased morbidity and mortality and associated increased economic costs. When a society is less healthy, it's not as productive and it's weaker. So it's sort of a tangent to your questions, more looking at the impacts on society from collapsing health supply chains. But I think This is really important. Countries are going to be less productive and weaker. So one adaptation that is needed is a greater use of data to demonstrate the importance of investing. So in an environment we said earlier where domestic resources are finite, needs are increasing, how do you ensure that investments are made in a way that brings returns to the health aspects of a country? So we need to be thinking about returns that brings local societies and health in society to be able to advocate for funding for that. Now, what's interesting is that funding of health is often seen as a cost rather than an investment. 2017, World Bank did some great work looking at different aspects of health investment, including supply chain commodities, and noticing that there was a return on investments where governments did that. So my point here is that how do we, in the country context, how do we support country governments to be getting better with their data, to be able to advocate for the funds they need to try and cushion some of this impact? And another aspect I think of adaptation, and again, this is in the context of crisis. And we know that it's very hard to adapt in times of crisis when you're putting out fires. But I think it's an opportunity to really double down and think, and this is sort of a bit towards Barry's question about dependence. But how can we support countries to double down on the idea of how to make their supply chains more efficient, how to leverage available technologies and an ecosystem of actors that can work together to meet local challenges? If there is no more funds coming, there is expertise in countries, how can that be used more readily? And I think part of this is governments to really help support governments to be taking on their role as overall stewards of the system, something we've spoken about several times. Now, this may mean that they improve the enabling environment of private sector to do more. It may mean that they need to improve their public-private partnership arrangements in some way. Countries like Kenya and Somalia are interesting examples of trying to move more in that public-private direction. So the long-term economic impacts are going to be huge. And I think looking at things differently is more about how to use data for advocating for investments, how to look at technology and improve supply chain processes, and then how can governments better take on their role as stewards, bringing that ecosystem of actors together to make the best with what technology, people, and interest there is in a country context. Thanks, Greg.
Yep, you bet. Thanks, Andre, especially talking about data-driven decision-making, if you will, and adaptation. It's all part of what we see and advocate in the commercial side of supply chains, and that's agility. All right, all good. Thank you, Craig. Would you like to comment on our third question as well?
Thanks, Greg. Much like Andrew, I've taken a slightly different approach as well. I've kept this a very country-centric thought process. So I'm going to dive in. The long-term impacts are dependent on how quickly countries are able to reach self-sufficiency. I know we've been talking about this for years, and to various degrees this has happened. Again, the pockets of countries we spoke about earlier, everyone does something well, and everyone does something badly. But that's the nature of life. That's the nature of business, even in the private sector. Some that do things well, and they have peaks and troughs. It's not a straight line of improvement. It also depends on the innovativeness of other donors to creatively fill the gap that each country requires to quickly get onto their path to recovery. And I think that help will come to you if you just ask the right folks. But again, it's not going to be a silver bullet. It's not going to be the help you need completely. There's an often used phrase, necessity is the mother of invention. This is well proven in the private sector. It's also important that the private sector is acknowledged as a willing and able partner. The private sector is actually what every country has in common. In the long term, it stands to reason that some regions and countries will solve the problems they face today with a sudden funding withdrawal, and others will lag behind. In my opinion, those success stories will seize the opportunity to grow their scale and scope, and maybe assist others to be successful. On that journey, as one tries to recover, we already see investment from China, India, and sometimes Russia in Africa, speaking about that one continent for this moment. And they may well help, but these will come with their own priorities and trade-off. The trade-off means what motivates them to help, so what do they want? Maintain an open awareness of those issues. The positive outcome in the long term, say 2050, 25 years' time, could be higher employment, improved expertise, and improved healthcare. It might sound like an impossible dream right now, but if you follow conscientiously the path to self-sufficiency, you might not become self-sufficient fully over that time frame, but you'll certainly be further towards that end than you are today. This forecast assumes collaboration, adoption of the private sector, and a conscious and considered effort towards self-sufficiency. Thanks, Craig.
You bet. Thanks, Greg. That answers to a certain point a question we had. A thread question was sustainability models, sustainable models going forward. And so appreciate answers to this particular question. With Ahmad, your thoughts, sir?
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to overlap a lot with what Craig has said. But let me start by saying that one of the most affected supply chain aspects of this funding has been consistently the commercial sector, based on the conversations that we've had regionally, as well as what we've assessed locally in many of the areas that we've worked in. Suppliers who previously had USAID funding as an assured asset, and as such stocked up on cargo in anticipation of the regular provision to programs that they won tenders for, meant that many of these suppliers find themselves in a predicament. Let's put it that way. However, many of those suppliers, went to the local market and started selling some of those commodities that they're unable to, and as such flooding the market in hopes of recouping some of those costs, which in itself also had quite an effect on other suppliers through this flooding system. So the loss is now being shared across the board in relation to specific commodities. Now, once the stop work orders piled up and, going to where we are now, with many of these suppliers finding themselves in a financial calamity, unable to cover their costs and losses, and with this market dynamic that we just discussed being prevalent, this highlights many of the effects that this withdrawal would have on the local economy in many regions. This will have dire consequences on these economies, as well as the trust that aid organizations in general. This is not confined to USAID funding. It's not confined to specific INGOs. It will cover the sector as a whole. This trust element is important, and the humanitarian sector as a whole within the market will feel the repercussions of that, as it could potentially affect the ability of those organizations to source locally, as well as exponentially increase the overall procurement cost for their programs going in the future, as a result of this risk element that suppliers will now have to account for if they're doing business. Another aspect is, how can we be sustainable, right? And going forward, the only way I can see this being implemented, again, to quote Craig, is by having this necessity becoming an opportunity, and us investing in self-sufficiency. When local programs, communities can be further educated, trained to provide for their own. And allow me to prove one case that comes to mind most recently. Even in the most protracted, fragile context, this could serve as a backbone towards, how we can respond to such needs in the future. And Gaza, most recently, had an example that I've looked into, where the local community, as a result of the embargo that was involved and the siege, etc., local supply chains and local investment strategies from the community meant that from a food security aspect, local communities started to put in and pitch in into growing the lands that they have, because that was the only mean of providing that level of food security that the communities obviously needed. Prior to the current crisis, the communities there and the sector as a whole, the agricultural sector, was about 70 to 80% self-sufficient. And that meant that they're not starting from scratch. And this is an aspect that other organizations can look at, where CBOs, community-based organizations, local actors can be further strengthened to be at such a position in the future where they're not as impacted by international funding as they are currently. Over.
Yep, thank you very much, Ahmad. That it brings up something that we advocate and wrestle with all the time in risk management, and that is risk is a two-sided coin, folks. When we say risk, most of us in our DNA think about a negative impact. But what we train folks in terms of risk management is it's a two-sided coin. One side is the negative impact. The other side is opportunity. All right. And the panelists mentioned in different ways a potential opportunity here, especially relative to the private sector. So do the panelists have any other follow-up in terms of what we've just talked about in terms of answering? Craig, you wanted to make a follow-up. Go ahead.
Thanks, Greg. I'm glad you spoke about the two-sided coin on risk. Mitigating risk is really paying it forward. But I wanted to pull the thread on the word sustainability, which is often stuck in my throat when I've heard it in the USAID context. I'd like to be provocative and just say that there is no such thing as sustainability as some people think about it. If one thinks of Amazon, Microsoft, I'm just picking two names of Apple. Those three names really impress everyone when they think of their success, their profitability, their innovation, and all the things come with it. But none of those organizations are sustainable. In fact, no organization in the world is sustainable unless they are perpetually managing the change that they face, the competitive landscape, the circumstances in each country, in each market, all the variables that impact a business's ability to do their job is only sustainable if that organization is adaptable and perpetually changing the way they do things in order to make the best of the hand that they've been dealt. So let's look at sustainability. Maybe it's not a magic bullet or the end result of a really wonderful effort, but a continuous ability to adapt and see risk for what it is. Thanks.
Yep, you bet. Any other panelists have any comments to augment this, the answers to this question of sustainability and long-term impacts on the global supply chains? Anyone?
Greg, I just wanted to jump in.
Yep.
I think just sort of reading through the chat and also picking up on some of the other threads that there is a disaster, whether it's health, whether it's food, there's all sorts of aspects to supply chain support, and we haven't labeled them more specifically. And I think what Craig was just saying in terms of the emphasis is on what's possible in the local context, given the resources and the people and so on that are there. I'm conscious that we're talking from all of our different experiences, and a lot of those experiences are really understand that it's local action by those in power that can make a difference. Yep, resources are limited. Yep, what can they achieve is limited. And I think more than ever, that is a particular emphasis. And those of us who are no longer working in the field with furloughed or other professionals everywhere, there's lots of knowledge and support that people want to provide and a lot of things that are available to assist. But I think we just need to, again, acknowledge that it's those who are leading in countries that really are in the big seat here with that. And I know that one of the closing things in a little while is about accessing further resources to assist. And I just think that that's particularly important. Thanks.
You bet. Anyone else have any follow-ups to our dialogue on the third question? Before we move on, I want to mention to the audience that concludes our overt discussion, folks, on the three major questions and answers from the panelists. We have several outstanding questions from the audience. We will stay here as long as the questions keep popping up. So we're ready, willing, and able to move forward. Just want to make sure the audience is aware of that. And just one other admin before we try to answer additional questions. This session is recorded. It'll be on the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium's website, probably by close of business March 24, next Monday, with answers to all questions posed during the session. So we will do our best to overtly answer every question that has come in so far and might come in a little later, but we are ready, willing, and able. And with that caveat, I will make mention of a question to the panelists. One comment was maybe the private sector can, if they know there's a market, step in. I think we've touched on that a bit, but do the panelists have any additional comments about that thread? It's not so much a question, but a thread. Who'd like to start? Craig, go ahead.
I think there's many examples. There's a lovely old saying from a former colleague, a rising tide raises all ships. As the humanitarian aid environment ramped up and as organizations like logistics companies began to do more work for the governments and for the donors, where they came from private sector backgrounds, there's many examples one can think of where those organizations have grown to such an extent that they went from one country to 10 countries. As the bar was raised with pharmaceutical distribution and warehousing, where temperature control and inventory management and cycle counting and all the things one knows one should do to do this properly began to become the norm, so industry in that area grew. So absolutely, I think the private sector will definitely rise to the occasion. When there's new business to be had, they'll take that expertise to wherever it's required, and therefore they'll fill many, many voids without even being requested. It'll just be a natural order of things. Thanks.
Yep, you bet. No, it's a good thread. Again, it's that two-sided coin. Hope is not a strategy, but one would think that potentially because of the impact and the sense of urgency for healthcare, that the private sector would and will step up. We don't know what that will look like. Anyone else have any threads? Go ahead there, Andrew.
Yeah, just to build on this, I think I've come to really respect the professional associations that we call healthcare federations. Great one in Uganda, great one in Kenya. There is a Pan-African Healthcare Federation. These healthcare federations have as their members private sector. And through COVID in a number of countries has really opened up the channels of communication with government to be able to act as not as one voice, but as a negotiating advocacy and a discussion voice where there are lots of voices in private sector. And I just was struck by the conversation at this point to really say that these federations, I think, certainly can have a role at helping to amplify the voice of private sector, interpret the need, and be able to help to coordinate some further actions of private sector in some way. Thanks.
Ahmad, did you have any thoughts on the threads that we've just talked about, especially from the audience who are somewhat, I guess, asking about how and would private sector us and private sector step up potentially and run public healthcare supply chains, maybe with a P&L, more of a P&L approach, I think is what we've we've been talking about, a commercial approach? Just a thought.
I think both Andrew and Craig covered the health aspect pretty well. I'm going to be more provoking in my thinking and tap into another aspect entirely. Maybe it's good to think of the private sector, but also another aspect that comes to mind, specifically in fragile contexts and regions such as ours, is the informal sector, which is in many parts of the world is quite a force to be reckoned with. And you know, officially the numbers aren't that official and that final in dictating the size of the informal sector, but they're a big player in the economy, specifically again in fragile sectors. So that might be an area that we can also further tap into. But when as far as food security, for example, is concerned, rather than public health. But when public health comes to mind, obviously, yes, you do need to have the private sector stepping up. However, I'm conscious of the fact that in many of these settings, the private sector has neither the scale nor the resources locally, I'm saying, to cater for that. So you do need a private sector coming out of, an international foreign investment sort of mechanism that looks into that. And I know in many cases that has been the case for many countries. But again, and I know Craig isn't the biggest fan of the sustainability model approach towards this, but the only way to be properly long-term thinking, if you will, not to use the S word, but the only way that we can have an approach that would be meaningful for many of these countries that have been reliant on aid for quite a while is to see this as an opportunity to invest more on a regional, perhaps, maybe more local approach that would prioritize some of the aspects that they have always been wrestling with, rather than things that have been put forward onto their table that may have not aligned very well, or have been, managed to cater to some of the many needs that have been there. But obviously, there are big shoes to fill with the USAID funding withdrawal, and to just say that the private sector could potentially step in, I would say, and based on the conversations that we had and the information we put through, I don't think that is a realistic expectation going on the next 5 years at least. No.
Yep. Okay, very good. Craig, go ahead, fire away. We'll finish up this thread. How about it?
Great additions, Ahmed, and I think you're so right. The request to private sector is going to be an appropriate request to meet their interest and their commercial expectations. I sat on a panel some years ago where we discussed public-private partnerships, and the one resultant thought we had was that there's a level of mutual suspicion between governments talking to private sector, and in turn, private sector talking to governments. From the governments talking to private sector is their profit motive will end up costing us more, even though the old logic we all understand as consumers is you get what you pay for, right? Mm-hmm. And the private sector would look at government and say, but will they pay me? And I think back to Mozambique with their conscious strategic design to outsource where possible. If you establish an outsourcing model and you go into it eyes open, bearing in mind outsourcing doesn't take you off the hook. You still need to manage the effort. So you might find managing an outsourced partner is more energy sapping than just doing it yourself, because managing it requires metrics, etc., etc. But if that's part of your modus operandi to outsource to the private sector, you might find it to be a really welcome event. Again, as I mentioned earlier, chat to Mozambique about the distribution experience, lessons learned. There's many other examples beyond Mozambique as well. I think Nigeria does it too. But there are models where private sectors really helped the government and grown as a result. And your points are well made, Ahmed. Informal sector, another huge one. No more better example than looking at South Africa. Pharmacies, etc., that have adapted to the private sector requirements in their own informal sector way, plugging many, many holes. Thanks.
You bet. One little thread that I can add, when we talk about outsourcing and supply chain, I've been in supply chain my entire career. There's a different skill set when you outsource certain elements of your supply chain. We call that orchestration. That is a different skill than managing inventory yourself. So there is a thread out there and a concept called orchestration. Companies like Cisco, just a little thread for the folks before we adjourn. Cisco, everyone knows them. 98% of all their product is produced by someone else. They don't make anything. Is that a risky supply chain? You bet. All right. They have 1,800 suppliers around the world. They don't make anything. What they're good at is orchestrating all we used to call it herding the cats. They orchestrate 1,800 suppliers to end up building large internet type of products. So I just wanted to make a thread there, make an injection to the audience about there is a concept and a skill set called orchestration when in fact you attempt to outsource certain elements of your supply chain. Good thread there. We don't have any active new questions from the audience. I want to make sure that the audience remembers that this will be recorded. It's recorded and it will be on the Supply Chain Consortium's website by March 24th. For the panelists, we've had some good comments. Folks have said, thank you very much. This has been great. One thread was we have to continue this conversation. So I think we've made an impact, gentlemen. And so with that, I want to sincerely thank our panel of experts. We all hope that this fireside chat was helpful to you all. We wish all professionals who've been affected by this black swan risk event all the best in terms of recovering and moving forward within an industry that we all hold very near and dear to our hearts. So with that, we will say all the best, be well all, and thank you very much, gents.
Thank you, Greg.